Imagine a world where every step outside your front door came with a calculation. Not just about where you were going, but about whether you would be safe, whether you would be seen, and how you would be judged. For Black Americans in the 1950s, daily life was not a casual stroll through freedom. It was a careful navigation of a country that had promised liberty but delivered walls. The law said one thing, the lived reality screamed another. Jim Crow signs hung heavy over public spaces, schools were separate, neighborhoods were divided, and opportunities were sliced thin. Yet, within this suffocating reality, Black communities discovered ingenious ways to carve out survival, dignity, and even joy. They built their own world, one brick, one whispered tactic, one hidden code at a time. The resilience of the Black community in the 1950s is often told only through the lens of march and protests, but the truth goes deeper. Resistance wasn't only on the picket lines. It was in kitchens, barbershops, churches, and corner stores. It was in the unspoken strategies passed down from parents to children, how to act in front of a white employer, how to respond when pulled over by the police, where to shop to avoid humiliation, and which neighborhoods to enter only in daylight. These tactics were the armor of daily life, crafted in silence yet powerful enough to keep generations alive. One of the most ingenious strategies lay in the Black church. On Sunday mornings, pews filled with voices raised in gospel, but the church was far more than a sanctuary of faith, it was the heartbeat of survival. Pastors were not just spiritual leaders. They were organizers, educators, and protectors. The church basement doubled as a school for teaching young men and women public speaking, debate, and leadership skills they could not access elsewhere. Weddings, funerals, and choir rehearsals were disguised opportunities for planning, whether it was pooling money to buy homes in Black neighborhoods, or quietly funding families whose breadwinner had been unjustly fired. The church was where dignity was restored and strategies were born, where every sermon carried coded encouragement to keep going, to keep resisting, to keep believing in a future that seemed impossible. Equally powerful was the role of Black-owned businesses. Imagine walking into a beauty salon in 1950s Alabama. The hum of hairdryers mixed with laughter and whispers. These spaces were not simply about hairstyles, they were safe havens. A barber or beautician knew everyone's struggles, and their shops became information hubs. People shared news about jobs that would actually hire Black workers, landlords who were fair, and schools worth fighting for. These shops became financial engines too, teaching their customers about credit, savings clubs, and how to navigate the dangerous waters of discrimination in banking. If banks would not lend to Black families, communities created their own systems. Susus, rotating. Savings clubs where each member contributed, and in turn, one person received the pot of money each week. It was trust-based and it worked. Families bought houses, opened shops, and sent their children to college through these quiet networks of shared resilience. Survival strategies also lived in the smallest of gestures. Parents taught their children a double language, the ability to shift speech, posture, and even body language depending on who they were speaking to. In the Black community, it was known as code switching, though few called it that at the time. It was about knowing when to speak plainly, when to stay silent, and when to nod instead of argue. This code kept young men alive in encounters with police, and helped Black women navigate the often harsh demands of working as maids and cooks in white households. Imagine the weight of constantly filtering yourself, carrying two versions of your identity everywhere you went, one for survival in the outside world, and one for truth inside your home. Yet this code switching was not simply submission, it was strategy. It was a way of protecting one's dignity while ensuring there would be another day to fight. Education itself became a battlefield and a survival tool. Even in crumbling segregated schools, teachers refused to let children believe they were lesser. Many worked unpaid overtime, tutoring after hours, slipping banned books into the hands of students, and telling them, "You are more than what the world tells you." Some classrooms became laboratories of resilience where children were not only taught arithmetic and grammar, but also the history their textbooks erased. Stories of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth were shared not as distant history, but as living proof that resistance was in their blood. These hidden lessons nurtured a quiet pride that no segregation law could erase. Then there were the kitchens, the heart of every black home. Food was more than nourishment, it was a survival strategy. Families stretched every dollar, turning scraps into feasts. Collard greens, cornbread, beans, rice, these weren't just meals, they were masterpieces of resilience. In many ways, food was also protest. To sit at a table together, to laugh and sing over a pot of stew, was to declare, we are still here, we will still love, we will still thrive. Recipes carried the weight of ancestry, and in the smell of a mother's kitchen, children felt the roots of survival. Perhaps the most invisible yet powerful strategy was collective memory. Elders told stories, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in songs, about what it meant to endure. A grandmother's story about her own struggles during the Depression was not just memory, but instruction. A grandfather's warning about the wrong part of town was not fear, but guidance. Oral tradition was the shield, passing down not just history, but the wisdom of survival. In every story, children learned that their struggle was not theirs alone, but part of a long river of endurance and resilience. But these strategies were not merely about getting by, they were about laying the groundwork for a different future. Underneath the daily grind, black communities in the 1950s were quietly preparing. They were building networks of lawyers, teachers, activists, and preachers who would later rise in the civil rights movement. The marsh of the 1960s did not spring up from nowhere, they were planted in the soil of these daily, unseen acts of survival. Imagine the courage it took. Every choice carried weight. Where to sit on a bus, what street to walk down, which store to enter, when to look someone in the eye and when to look away. A wrong choice could bring humiliation or worse. Yet, day after day, black families got up, dressed their children, sent them to school, went to work, cooked meals, prayed, and loved. That was resistance too. To create joy in the middle of oppression, to dream in the face of nightmares, that was their genius. The 1950s are often remembered in America as a golden age of prosperity, gleaming cars, tidy suburbs, television families smiling at dinner, but for black Americans that vision was a mirage. Their golden age was not on television. It was found in the unshakable bonds of community, in the whispered wisdom of survival, and in the determination to pass something stronger to the next generation. These forgotten strategies remind us that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, hidden in plain sight. It is the mother's prayer, the teacher's extra lesson, the church's collection plate, the secret savings passed hand to hand. Together, these strategies formed an unbreakable shield against a world that sought to erase them. And yet, this is only part of the story, because survival was just the beginning. Beneath the strategies, beneath the whispered tactics, lay a fire that could not be contained. A fire that would soon burst into the open, challenging the nation to face itself. Survive in America during the 1950s as a black family meant mastering a kind of quiet genius, one that never received headlines, yet shaped the fabric of the nation. But survival, while necessary, was never the final goal. Beneath the day-to-day tactics lay something even more powerful: the determination to change the very system that demanded such strategies in the first place. Think of a young boy in Mississippi, 1952. He walks home from school, his shoes worn thin. Along the way, he knows to avoid certain roads where a white mob might gather. At home, his mother tells him to keep his head down, to be polite, to never look too proud when speaking to a white man. Yet, inside his own community, that same boy hears another message. In church, he is told he is made in God's image, worthy of respect. His teacher whispers, "You will go farther than me, farther than anyone thinks you can." The boy is living in two Americas at once, one that crushes and one that lifts. The very act of holding those two worlds in tension was itself a survival strategy, a way of carrying hope when despair lurked at every turn. Daily life for black Americans was often marked by small humiliations, but the community developed ways to transform those moments into strength. When barred from restaurants, families held fish fries in backyards where laughter and music filled the air. When denied entry to movie theaters, church halls became stages for plays, musicals, and talent shows. Out of exclusion, they created their own joy, their own cultural richness. And in those gatherings, a seed of defiance grew. For every door that was slammed shut, another was quietly built in their own neighborhoods. Parents and elders did not always lecture children about injustice directly. It was often too dangerous, too heavy, but they showed them through action. A father who returned home from a grueling shift at a factory still found time to fix a neighbor's roof. A mother who worked long hours as a maid still sewed her daughter's dress for graduation, insisting on dignity in the face of hardship. These acts taught children that even if the world outside treated them as invisible, they were to value themselves as whole, as complete, as worthy of care and pride. That lesson, that inner dignity could not be stolen, became a cornerstone of survival. At the same time, whispers of change traveled across the nation. Black newspapers, often ignored by the mainstream, carried stories of injustice but also of victory, small wins in courtrooms, rising voices in politics, athletes breaking barriers. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Norfolk Journal and Guide, these papers were more than news, they were lifelines. Delivered to barbershops and kitchen tables, they became tools of strategy. Articles shared advice on safe travel routes, on where protests were brewing, on which lawyers could be trusted. For many, these newspapers were the internet of their time, linking scattered communities into one shared fight. Travel itself was a battlefield of survival. The Green Book, officially titled the Negro Motorist Green Book, was one of the most ingenious survival guides of the era. At first glance, it looked like a simple travel booklet listing gas stations, hotels, and restaurants. But for black families, it was nothing less than a map of freedom. Without it, a road trip could mean sleeping in the car, being turned away from every diner, or facing threats on dark highways. With it, families could navigate America with some measure of safety, knowing where they would be welcomed. The Green Book was more than paper. It was a quiet rebellion against invisibility, proof that black lives would not simply disappear. And then there was music, the soul of survival. In juke joints, in basements, on radios tuned low, music became medicine. Blues carried the pain of daily life, gospel carried the promise of tomorrow, and jazz spoke to the unshakable creativity of a people who refused to be defined only by suffering. A song could not stop discrimination, but it could lift spirits high enough to endure another day. For many, humming a tune while sweeping floors or whistling on the walk to work was not just habit, it was armor, a rhythm to keep despair at bay. But by the mid-1950s, survival was no longer enough. The strategies of endurance were evolving into strategies of resistance. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 did not emerge out of thin air. It was the fruit of decades of quiet preparation. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she was not acting alone. She was standing on the foundation built by countless teachers, ministers, and community organizers who had been training, strategizing, and planning for years. Her act of defiance was the visible spark, but the fuel had been gathered long before in those church basements, those beauty salons, those whispered lessons between parents and children. Black women, in particular, carried strategies that historians have too often overlooked. They were the ones who kept families fed on meager wages, who stretched every dollar, who organized the networks of care that kept communities strong. It was women who led clubs that doubled as support groups, pooling money for families in need, arranging childcare for mothers who worked long hours, and planning voter registration drives. Behind many of the visible leaders of the civil rights era stood countless women who had already been leading, quietly and powerfully in the 1950s. Their strategies of survival, financial cooperation, mutual aid, and relentless nurturing were the scaffolding of the larger movement to come. It is easy, today, to think of the 1950s only as a prelude to the civil rights movement. But that misses the true genius of the time. The strategies of daily survival were resistance. Every time a black teacher told a child they could be great, it was resistance. Every time a family pooled savings to buy a home in a segregated neighborhood, it was resistance. Every time a grandmother told a story of strength instead of despair, it was resistance. Survival itself became a radical act because it carried within it the seed of tomorrow's freedom. Imagine, again, that young boy in Mississippi. He grows up listening to his mother's warnings, his father's prayers, his teacher's encouragement. By the end of the decade, he is a teenager, old enough to walk into a meeting where neighbors are planning a protest against segregated buses. He remembers every lesson, every whispered survival strategy, and now he is ready to step into resistance. His survival has been his training ground. His dignity, fiercely protected by his community, has become the foundation for action. The story of Black America in the 1950s is not simply one of oppression. It is a story of ingenuity, of strategies crafted in silence but rooted in brilliance. It is the story of a people who, despite every attempt to erase them, found ways to preserve joy, nurture hope, and prepare for a future that would demand courage. It is the story of survival that turned into revolution. And so, when we look back, we must remember the real genius of the 1950s was not only in the march or the speeches that followed, but in the hidden strategies of everyday life. The shared meals, the whispered warnings, the collective savings, the secret lessons, the coded songs. These were the survival tactics that became the architecture of freedom. The world may not have seen them. History books may not have recorded them. But they lived in kitchens, in churches, in classrooms, in hearts. They lived in every smile that defied despair, in every hug that reassured a child, in every prayer whispered against the odds. And because they lived, a movement was born. So imagine again a world where survival itself was resistance. A world where dignity was not handed down from power, but carved out through community. That was Black America in the 1950s, and in their strategies, forgotten by many, we find not just a story of survival, but a blueprint of resilience for all time.